we're going to spend this time to go over this quadrilateral quiz that you all had last week. And we're going to really stick to using the family tree as a source. And we're going to see how memorizing that tree can really help you to get the answers to nearly all of the questions on this test. So the first question was very straightforward. Which statement about quadrilaterals is true? All quadrilaterals have 4 right angles. All quadrilaterals have equal sides. All quadrilaterals have 4 sides. All quadrilaterals are parallelograms. So the prefix quad means 4. So this one is straightforward. You just need to know that a quadrilateral has 4 sides. A parallelogram must be a rectangle when diagonals are perpendicular, diagonals are congruent, opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent. So let's look at our family tree to try to help us out with these answer choices. We want to know when a parallelogram has to be a rectangle. So a parallelogram could be a rectangle, it could be a rhombus, it could be a square. But which properties make it have to be a rectangle? The first choice is diagonals are perpendicular. The diagonals are perpendicular for a rhombus and for a square. So that would not make it have to be a rectangle. The next choice are that the diagonals are congruent. The only spot where diagonals are congruent is written as a rectangle, and a square also has to take after a rectangle because a square comes below a rectangle. So your answer for this question would have to be diagonals are congruent. Opposite sides being parallel is a property of a parallelogram. So any of the things below could have been following that property. Opposite sides are congruent is also a property of a parallelogram. So once again, it could have been any. A parallelogram must be a rhombus if its diagonals do what? So I'm going to look at the properties of a rhombus. What specifically do the diagonals of a rhombus do? The diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular and they bisect opposite angles. Are the diagonals congruent? No, that's in a rectangle, not a rhombus. Do the diagonals bisect each other? Sure, but the diagonals bisect each other in a rectangle, rhombus, and square. That doesn't mean it has to be a rhombus. Diagonals do not bisect its angles. That's false. The diagonals do bisect the angles, specifically the opposite angles. But we know the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. Which information is not sufficient to prove that a parallelogram is a square? If you want to show that a parallelogram is a square, you need to find something very specific, okay? What you would want to aim to do is show that the square takes on something from a rhombus and takes on something from a rectangle. What I'd like you guys to remember is that the rectangle and the rhombus are like parents. So one is the mother and one is the father, and the square is the baby. The square takes on properties from each of them, and that's what makes the square unique. So it must do something from here, and it must do something from here in order to be a square. Are the diagonals both congruent and perpendicular? Well, if I look, diagonals are congruent comes from a rectangle. Diagonals are perpendicular comes from a rhombus. One from each would make it a square. I want to know what's not sufficient, so I'm not going to pick that. The diagonals are congruent, and one pair of adjacent sides are congruent. So if I look at a rhombus, the diagonals being congruent is not a property of the rhombus, but diagonals being congruent is a property of the rectangle. And one pair of adjacent sides are congruent. So let's think about this. If I know this side is 4 and this side is 4, and I know this shape has to be a parallelogram says the opposite sides are congruent. So now this is definitely 4 and this is definitely 4. So now I've got all 4 sides congruent, a property of a rhombus, and I've got diagonals congruent, a property of a rectangle. So this would be sufficient. The diagonals are perpendicular, and one pair of sides are congruent. The diagonals being perpendicular is a property of a rhombus. One pair of sides are congruent. Now, if you only have one pair of sides congruent, you're not going to be a square. Because we know for sure a square has 4 equal sides. So the fact that you see only one pair of sides are equal, that should be alarming. The only shape that has one pair of sides equal is an isosceles trapezoid. Alright? The property of a parallelogram says that your opposite sides are congruent. So you always need to have 2 pairs of sides equal. So this would not be sufficient. In a certain quadrilateral, 2 opposite sides are parallel. The other 2 opposite sides are not congruent. Again, this is a big red flag. You have another pair of opposite sides that are not equal. But every parallelogram has opposite sides that are equal. So that would mean the shape would have to be a trapezoid.